This is panel 8, entitled Voter Inclusion and Accessibility. And we have 3 papers today. And we'll go in the order as listed in the program, 15 minutes each. And then at the end, Robert Boatright will provide some discussant comments for another 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So the first paper up is called Public Outreach and Election Administration by Travis Ridout. Travis, you're on.
All right, well, thank you very much. All right, so this is some research that I have been doing with Taewoo Kang of Siena University. And so we start out with the oft-noted problem that there is declining voter confidence in elections in the United States, and that could lead to a host of negative consequences, including declining legitimacy for election officials and even election-related violence. And so we wanted to kind of tackle this issue from the perspective of election officials. Of course, in order to run a smooth election, it helps when the public has confidence in those elections. And so we were really focused on the activities that election officials are undertaking in order to speak to the public. And we wanted to focus in particular on political advertising. Why focus on advertising? We think advertising is important because it allows them to speak to people who might not normally be following, say, the Facebook page of their state election official. You can target messages to people who may be most in need of receiving those messages. And so in this research, we asked, to what extent do election officials speak to the public through their ads? How much is spent on this advertising? And what is the content of that message? How much of that content is really designed to try to combat that low voter confidence? And so we examine advertising from the top election officials in each state in the United States. We look at spending first. This includes spending on TV ads. These are data we obtained from the Wesleyan Media Project and span 2020 to 2025. We also look at spending on social media platforms, including the Meta platform, so Instagram and Facebook, Google, which includes YouTube, and then Snap. And that covers the time period from 2018 to 2025. To look at the content of this advertising, we focus on ads that were placed on Meta. So again, Facebook and Instagram. We only look at the text of those ads. We don't look at the visuals. That makes coding more complicated. But the text does include a lot, including the main body, captions, and even some link text. And so we did this kind of the old-fashioned way with human coding of the advertising. We started with just a sample of the ads and did an inductive development of themes that we found in those ads. We did some initial coding, which led us to refine those various themes that we found in the ads, and then put those themes into 5 larger categories. So the biggest category was providing information. Mobilization or get out the vote messaging was another large category we found in those ads. Building trust was there as well. Efforts to address misinformation. And then finally, soliciting people to work at the polls. And so let me start first by talking about spending. So all told, across that 8-year time period, we found about 13.6 million US dollars in spending on advertising on the social media platforms. The bulk of that went to Meta, and there was actually even more on Snap, a fairly small platform, than there was on Google. that was about 8,000 different ad buys in total. And well, I shouldn't say about, exactly 41 states had spending on social media. If we look at spending on TV by cycle, we found about $7.75 million in spending. Almost half of that uh, came in the current election cycle, 25-26, thanks in part to a ton of spending by the state of Louisiana, which changed its primary voting system. And so they've been spending a lot on TV ads to try to inform the electorate about that change. In terms of the content of the advertising, we did some simple analyses of the top word stems and phrases, and I don't think any of these would be a surprise. Top stems include vote, elect, ballot, voter, regist. Top phrases include election day, general election, early voting, register to vote, primary election. You do see a bit further down on the stems, though, uh, like the word secure and safe. And so further down, it seems like there are some efforts to boost voters' confidence in the election process. We also examined the use of some of these phrases by state. Specifically, here's secure, or that stem without the E. It was quite common in Wyoming, North Dakota, Georgia, Ohio, absent in some other states. Safe was also quite common, especially in Ohio, Nevada, Illinois, New York, but absent in other states. We should also note, because we've been doing this coding by hand, a lot of the references, or at least some of the references to safe, refer to COVID safety back in 2020. The polling place will be safe. You won't get sick if you vote in person. Wear a mask to stay safe. Those sorts of things. Um, and so breaking down the content into our larger categories, we found that 86% of the ad buys tried to convey some sort of information. So that was quite common. 43% contained a mobilization message. 24 had a message that fell into that trust category. 6% were trying to solicit poll workers, and 5% address the idea of misinformation. And so we break down those categories into a little more specific categories. We find that entreaties to learn more at a website or through an app or a voter hotline were the most common, appearing in more than half of the ad buys. Mentions of mail-in or absentee ballots were also quite common. Reminders of actually when election day was appeared in over a third of the ads. It was also quite common to mention deadlines. So when do you need to have that ballot returned? What's the last day to register to vote? Those sorts of things. Breaking down the mobilization content, by and large, the most common message was just a general one: go out and vote. But there were also encouragements to register. And also, in about 10% of ads, there was this framing on, making a plan to vote. Are you ready to vote? Perhaps drawing upon some of the literature that shows that people are more likely to take action if they have a plan to do something. In terms of building trust, by far the most common message was a very general one, that your vote is safe, your vote is secure. That appeared in 21% of the ad buys. But some of the ads did get more specific. So 8% had descriptions of specific security protocols that the election officials were using. 7% had some descriptions of technology. Less common were discussions of safety of drop boxes or the accuracy of voter rolls, or the bipartisan or nonpartisan nature, which hardly appeared in any of the ads at all. And so, just to do a bit of summarizing now, we find I would describe it as minimal advertising from state election officials. It was about $53,000 per state per year. This might beg the question, well, why don't they spend more money trying to speak to voters? Um, and perhaps the most basic answer is money is scarce, right? And other needs are more pressing. If the ballot machine is broken, that has to take precedence over trying to send messages to the public. Others have noted that election officials aren't necessarily happy with Meta these days. They've made some changes in their transparency. They've reduced transparency in terms of advertising, and also rolled back attempts to police misinformation. And so maybe election officials don't want to be spending money with that company. And they might just not see the value in that advertising. Now, how would you measure? I'm sure there are ways to measure the effectiveness of that advertising, but it seems like it would be a difficult task to pin down. Um, as I pointed out, advertising, of course, is not the only way that election officials attempt to speak to and inform the electorate. There's organic media, they have websites, some travel around states, give talks, things like that. But again, we would argue that ads are an especially important component of that public advertise or public information effort, because they can be targeted to those who most likely or who most need to receive that message. That 18-year-old who's a first-time voter may not be going down to the public library to listen to the Secretary of State when she's in town, but you might be able to target that 18-year-old with some information through an ad on their favorite social media platform. And so, in terms of follow-up research, we have ideas. We found in doing this research, there's actually a lot of advertising related to voting, vote, um, that comes from, I would say, unofficial sources, both partisan sources and nonpartisan sources. And so we're curious how the content of those messages compares to the content of those messages from the state election officials. There's also the issue of just the message effectiveness. There's some research showing that, experimental research showing that the nonpartisan cue actually tends to work in increasing voter trust in elections. And yet, election officials barely use that message. Why is that? And how effective are the messages that they are commonly using? One might want to do some research examining the effectiveness of those messages. And so I think I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Very good. Thank you, Travis. Next up, we have a paper by Susan Orr and collaborators called Convenient or Coercive, Vote by Mail in U.S. Elections in 2020 and 2024. Susan.
So first of all, I would say that all my co-authors are not liable for any mistakes or errors in this presentation because this is a really rough draft and a first cut at looking at some of the data. And it's super rough. I had some issues while I was putting this together. But I thank all of you and I thank you for this opportunity because it really is a project where we have some data, and I think it was important to let people know that the data exists. But I'm not fully sure what I think about it. The data doesn't speak for itself, and so to share this and get some feedback is really valuable. So to give you some background and an overview, I want to share the motivating question. Some of the data is just a first cut, and then obviously there's a lot of questions that arise from the data. We started this project prior to the 2020 election, and the interest in the motivating question was really about, as we see the expansion of vote by mail, and it was US centered. So as we see the expansion of vote by mail, what does that mean for electoral integrity? And particularly with respect to, once you take ballots out of the polling station, you can no longer guarantee secrecy. So one of my co-authors and I have done some other work on the history of the secret ballot, the reason the secret ballot was introduced, and basically how the mechanism works and sort of what were the consequences of introducing the secret ballot. So it really is predicated on the idea that no one can find out how you voted, or no one can see how you voted, so you can't be bribed or coerced. You have no credible means to prove how you voted. And so therefore it takes away that impetus. And it's imperfect, and it always has been imperfect. But when you take the ballot outside of the polling station into the home or into the office to have them completed, you can no longer guarantee that secrecy. So this was a sort of motivating question, but we started our research right at the time where the idea of mail-in voting became very politicized with COVID, and then claims that there was fraud and all that. So there's some issues and concerns I have with that context, but that was the motivating question. And the question in the title, is it costly or convenient, really stems from the fact that we do have some good data now on what's the impact in terms of expanding the electorate through making voting more convenient with mail-in voting. I think that was the original impulse. And we've got a lot of research. Obviously, there's some variation in the findings, but they seem to be settling on the conclusion that it makes some impact on turnout, but not as much as initially maybe people had hoped. And generally, what it does is it increases turnout among those who are likely to vote, but maybe not in certain elections, so infrequent voters, rather than bringing new people into the electorate. And like I say, there's some variation in the studies, but that's really consistent, a kind of 2 to 3% increase in turnout, but not an expansion of bringing different kinds of voters into the electorate. And importantly, no real partisan advantage. So Republicans and Democrats are almost equally as likely to not see an advantage from the vote by mail mechanism. So that's the background. What you're seeing here on the screen is the use of vote by mail over time and different modalities of voting. Is the red trend line on that is the vote by mail. So it is an important, I'm using this really to illustrate that vote by mail is increasing. It had a peak, a big uptick in 2020, but in 2024, there was a kind of increase over what had been prior to 2020. And just for background, we have 8 states now in the United States that are exclusively, or they're called universal vote by mail states. And then 26 other states now have no excuse absentee ballots. 8 of those, you can be on a permanent absentee ballot list, so you opt in one time and then you always get a mail-in ballot. So they're kind of functionally equivalent to a vote by mail state. So that's the background. Our data, and we have 2 waves of data, one from 2020 and one from 2024. And we were fortunate to get a grant to have data collected by NORC out of the University of Chicago. And we were part of a time-sharing experiment project that they had, which was funded by the NSF. Originally, what we did in the first wave of data collection, we were doing a list experiment to see if we could get good estimates of whether people were threatened or intimidated when they voted in the home rather than voting in the polling place. The experiment failed spectacularly. We did not find any real differences between those that were shown the option on the list of intimidation and those that were not. So that was a failure, but we do have descriptive data that I think is important to share. And that's now we have that from 2 electoral cycles. So let me get into some of the data. So what you're seeing here is just about our sample, what percentage voted by different modalities. So you see, as is the case in general, we had more people voting in person in 2024 than 2020, but our percentages roughly map the national trends. We used the people who did not vote to gather further information in the 2024 survey, and I'll share that with you in a second. So one concern that we had when we were thinking about opportunities to intimidate people in terms of how they vote when they're in the home was whether or not there was disagreement within households, because there is a perception that people are now quote unquote matched, and we marry people and live with people and cohabit people who are like us politically. And so therefore the question would be kind of moot, because if everyone agrees, then there's no real opportunity for coercion or pressure. And we found out that that was really the case to some extent, but not the complete story. So there is still considerable disagreement in households. So what you're seeing on the screen now is how many people in your household agree with you politically. And it's about, the figures don't alter that much from 2020 to 2024. It's about 50% of a household agree. And then we have about a quarter of people who have differences in agreement, support different candidates, all agree except for me as a smaller. So, and then obviously there's some single household. So there is a group of people. What's the point here? There is a group of people who would be vulnerable to coercion, undue pressure into respect to how they vote. So I think I should speed up a little bit here. This information that you're going to get, this data that's coming up, is all from the people who decided not to vote. So they abstained from voting. So we were interested to know how many people were threatened or intimidated. And the question in the survey was, were you worried about physical harm, a loss of job, some kind of serious hardship? And was that placed upon you to prevent you from voting? And the numbers who responded positively are small in each year. So we've got 1.6% in 2020 and 2.1% in 2024. We had reviewers look at our original data. Some of them said that we had too high of a threshold. So physical harm, loss of job, serious hardship, that seemed like too hard of a barrier. So in 2024, we put a lower threshold question. So did people insult you? Did they call you names? Did they press you in other ways? And in this case, it's to stop you from voting. But we use the same wording when it comes to make you vote for a particular candidate. So on that, I just have data there for 2024, and we got a positive result of 2.8%. So with those together, it's close to 5% of people in 2024 that said, yes, we had some social pressure to prevent us from voting. I really need to speed up. We asked a more general question. Did you avoid voting? Partly because you were worried that someone might threaten or intimidate you. And it maps nicely. We have 4.5% there. So it maps with the direct questions about pressure and intimidation. I'm going to skip this because we asked people if they decided to vote, how would they have voted? This is a really important slide, especially given the former presentation, because we asked people do you think your vote is secret? Right? You're supposed to, your vote is supposed to be kept secret. How likely do you think that is the case? And we had more than 50% of people, regardless of modality, whether they were voting in home or voting in the polling station, that did not believe their vote was secret. Now, that's understandable if you're voting at home. You may deliberately not keep it secret, but it's not understandable if you're at the polling station. And it was interesting that none of
Okay.
so the point on this one is just that half of people, regardless of modality, do not believe their vote is secret. Um, so now I'm moving on to here's information from voters. These are just simple crosstabs. You've got 2020 and 2024. And did someone threaten or intimidate you to make you vote for a specific candidate? Now, these are small percentages, but they are increasing. So you can see from 2020 to 2024, the number roughly doubles. It's still a small percentage. In 2024, it's roughly the amount that you would expect as a bump in turnout from vote by mail. Is this a trend? We don't really know. And this is where it's kind of, is there a problem? Is there not a problem? Some people can look at this and say this is actually an endorsement of democratic elections. There's not much of a problem. Others might look at it and think, oh, this is potentially problematic as we're moving forward. Did someone pressure and sought you to make you vote? This is in 2024 only because we didn't ask this question in 2020. And again, you see an increase in the by mail versus in person. It's small, but it's not nothing. We also asked the question about, do you feel social pressure? And that really didn't have a big effect whatsoever. I would say here, I've dug a little bit deeper into the data, and it seems to be not a gender issue, but an age issue. So in 2024, people who voted by mail and who reported being threatened, it was 11.7% among the 18 to 29-year-old category. So I didn't find any differences based on gender, but I did find differences based on age. The source, these are small numbers. The source of the pressure or intimidation is quite mixed. Family members, friends, someone who you work with. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and we have some data on what was your experience of voting, both in person and by mail. And the story here is if you vote in person, you're mostly voting in a private booth or at a table with a partition, so a very private space. And mostly you think that no one saw your ballot. So what you're seeing here is, did anyone see your ballot? No, we've got 72, 73%. Unsure but unlikely, that takes it up to sort of close to 90%. So this is in-person voters. Most people think no one sees their ballot, and most people don't discuss their ballot with others. If we turn to voting experience of voting but at home, most people do complete their ballot at home, a few in the office or at school or somewhere else. Mostly it's at home. And what we find here is that there is more common response in terms of someone saw my ballot. So about a third of people think, yeah, it's likely that someone saw my ballot. And maybe more importantly, and this again is a question for discussion, a third of people say, yes, I discussed my ballot with others. I openly talked about my ballot and discussed it with others. And again, that's where interpretation matters. You could see that as a benign or maybe helpful conversation, a civic dialogue, or it could be a potential problematic concern because we're not really keeping secrecy about the voting process. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Susan. And the last paper up today is called Revisiting Out-of-Country Voting. the dilemma of large diasporas and wafer-thin margins in developing countries. And representing this group of authors will be Hina, Binte, Haq.
Good day, everyone. I'm Dr. Hina, and on behalf of my co-authors, I'd like to take you on a journey into the new map of democracy. It's a story where elections are no longer decided solely within national borders, but increasingly by millions of citizens living abroad. So for decades, overseas voting was just a logistical footnote. It mostly involved tiny remote populations, think diplomats or deployed military personnel, that was relatively easy to manage and almost never really impacted the final outcome of an election. But what happens when millions vote from abroad? We're talking about massive global diasporas from developing nations acting as literal political kingmakers. Across the world, developing countries are increasingly extending voting rights to citizens living abroad, and the numbers involved are nothing short of remarkable. According to the UN International Migrant Stock Dataset, India has an estimated 18.5 million citizens living overseas. Mexico has approximately 11.6 million, while Pakistan has around 6.3 million. Now, those aren't small expatriate communities anymore. They represent populations comparable to entire countries. Once diasporas reach this scale, they begin to fundamentally reshape the political landscape back home. Now, to measure the real-world impact of overseas voting, we have a compelling empirical case study, Pakistan's 2018 general election. Pakistan is the world's fifth most populous country and has a diaspora of more than 6.3 million people, roughly 2.5% of its total population. Now, Pakistan's overseas community isn't just a potential electoral force, it's also a vital economic lifeline, contributing remittances worth around 9.4% of the nation's GDP. Now, when you combine a diaspora of that scale with Pakistan's history of volatile democratic landscape and wafer-thin electoral margins, you get an ideal environment to examine whether overseas voters could genuinely influence election outcomes. We compiled a comprehensive constituency-level data set comparing two key metrics. The first is the margin of victory, the number of votes separating the winning candidate from the runner-up. And the second is the estimated overseas voter population, which is the number of eligible citizens living abroad who belong to that same constituency. Now, by comparing these two figures across constituencies, we uncover a hidden variable in electoral politics, whether the pool of potential overseas voters is actually larger than the margin that decided the election. Now, we ask a simple but powerful question. What if overseas voters were fully mobilized? Now, to answer it, we compare two numbers for each constituency, the margin of victory and the estimated number of eligible overseas voters. Now, the contrast is striking. Notice the tiny blue bars at the bottom of the chart. Those represent the margins of victory, often just a few hundred votes. Now compare them with the towering yellow bars. Those represent the estimated overseas voters from those very same constituencies, often numbering in the tens of thousands. Take NA21, for example. That election was decided by just 35 votes. Yet, the constituency has more than 50,000 eligible overseas voters. What's even more striking is that these razor-thin margins weren't confined to obscure constituencies. They included seats contested by some of the biggest names in Pakistani politics. Now, when we extend this analysis across all 272 National Assembly constituencies, we uncovered significant findings. In 186 out of 272 National Assembly constituencies, the estimated number of eligible overseas voters exceeded the winning margin. That means in over 2/3 of the country's national races, the overseas vote was mathematically material. It possessed the sheer volume necessary to just completely flip the results. Now, overseas voters do not uniformly vote, and the turnout is historically low. This is where the concept of the swing factor comes in. That's the actual turnout percentage needed to change an outcome. Now, we model different realistic levels of participation. Even with a super modest 5% turnout amongst overseas voters, assuming they favored the runner-up, 19 National Assembly seats could be swayed. At just a 10% turnout, 30-seat swing. And if you somehow manage to reach a 50% turnout, up to 116 seats could be flipped. The whole board changes. So pivoting to the macro level impact, let's look at a really concrete scenario from 2018. The winning party, PTI, formed a coalition government, but if they had wanted to secure a simple majority, all on their own, assuming they kept the 9 independent candidates who joined them, they only needed 12 additional seats. And because those margins were so unbelievably tight, flipping those 12 specific seats would have required just over 19,000 highly targeted overseas votes. We're talking about a country of over 250 million people, and fewer than 20,000 votes from abroad would have completely altered the structure of the ruling government. Now, the vulnerability cuts both ways. If PTI had lost just 5 key seats, requiring almost 2,500 strategically placed votes, it would have lost its ability to form the government, despite there being over 170,000 eligible overseas voters in those constituencies. Now, the data here makes it undeniably crystal clear. Overseas voters are not just some demographic slice. They are a highly concentrated bloc with unparalleled leverage over the final balance of power. Now, beyond the mathematics lies a deeper debate surrounding the electoral influence of a large diaspora. Rather than assimilate overseas votes directly into domestic constituencies like Pakistan, Italy created a separate overseas constituency, enabling overseas voters to elect a fixed number of representatives, 12 deputies and 6 senators. This was regardless of the size of the overseas electorate. However, despite these safeguards, overseas votes proved pivotal in Romano Prodi's 2006 election victory. And when you combine that deep philosophical dilemma with unproven internet voting technology, which can aptly be called a Trojan horse, well, the risks just multiply exponentially. To try and manage its diaspora, Pakistan actually piloted an internet voting system for overseas citizens during the 2018 by-elections. At the time, this was literally the largest deployment of internet voting in a binding election anywhere in the world. And the results? Honestly abysmal. Out of over 630,000 eligible voters, a mere 1.17% actually registered to use the system. Worse, on election day, the system was hit with over 7,000 DDoS attacks. I mean, think about the multi-layered cybersecurity your own bank uses just to protect your checking account. Now imagine trying to seamlessly secure a binding national election overnight. Shortly after the pilot, the entire system was completely shelved due to severe security and legislative concerns, including, crucially, the total loss of ballot secrecy. Internet voting is so often pitched as the sleek modern solution for developing nations, but in practice, it acts as a total black box. It strips away the essential visible checks and balances that developing democracies absolutely rely on to ensure trust in the results. So the crucial point is exactly what we surrender for this convenience. The internet voting pilot in Pakistan eliminated no fewer than 14 distinct election integrity mechanisms that are normally present in supervised paper balloting. I'm talking about things we take for granted, like poll worker supervision, accredited party agents, the verification of empty ballot boxes before voting even begins, indelible ink marks to prevent double voting, physical privacy screens, public counting, and the whole shebang. Bypassing this 14 safeguards opens the door wide to coercion and vote buying, especially in regions where the home country's election commission has absolutely no legal mandate or ability to investigate. And there's also a really critical point to be made here about transparency. To even conduct this study, the researchers literally had to fight to extract the data. They had to file 7 separate rights and information requests. The greatest challenge in elections is not producing a winner. It's producing a result that everyone believes is legitimate. And that may be the most difficult challenge of overseas internet voting. Now, ultimately, technology should strengthen, not undermine, the legitimacy of elections. Because in the end, it is legitimacy, not technology, that sustains democracy. In conclusion, when large diasporas intersect with wafer-thin electoral margins, overseas voting is no longer a peripheral issue. As developing nations rightfully seek to embrace their citizens abroad, How do we practically enfranchise millions of people without sacrificing the secret ballot and the fundamental integrity of the electoral process? Now, it's a dual-edged sword of massive proportions. And as our research so clearly shows, the mathematical margins for error are incredibly thin. Thank you for joining me in this analysis today, and I really hope this deep dive into the data sparks engaging discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hina. And now we'll turn to our discussant, Robert Boatright from Clark University. Robert, you have as much as 15 minutes if you need
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for including me in this panel. I think it's always the job of the discussant to tell a story about how all the papers speak to each other, and sometimes it's kind of made up. But in this case, I think all of these papers really do fit quite nicely together. All of them have to do with very infrequent events and problems. That is, for the most part in the United States, not that many people vote by mail, although the number's growing. In the case of the Pakistan paper, certainly most people do not vote outside of the country. And in the case of the Ridout paper, the paper is at least implicitly about voter fraud. So all of these are rare events and problems, but events that I think can have tremendous influence on public support for election results. Moreover, I think all of these papers very carefully deal with the distinctions we would draw between verifiable instances of corruption, fraud, malfeasance, and so on, and the extent to which beliefs that these things are happening might influence public attitudes. A final thing that I would add that is not necessarily present in all of these papers, but I think is worth considering, is that all of these innovations are things that are costly. That is, it's costly to set up a voting system for people outside the country. It's costly to provide security checks for vote by mail. It is costly to advertise about election results. So there's certainly questions to be asked about how far states should go. That is, how much money should be invested in placating the public that these things are being done in a transparent and fair way, and so on. I'm going to deal with these papers in the order I wrote about them, which is not necessarily the order you presented them. So let me start with the Susan Orr paper. Let me just summarize what I take to be the main story here about voting by mail, and then I can get into some of my questions. So this paper is based on a survey of voters in U.S. elections from 2020 and 24. The main question here is whether the expansion of vote by mail erodes the protections given by the secret ballot, thereby trading convenience and increased turnout for electoral trust and integrity. The crucial problem that is here, of course, is that there's sort of a partisan imbalance in who votes by mail. You note this in the paper that across the states you look at, Democrats are between 50 and 100% more likely to vote by mail. Furthermore, the states that have universal vote by mail, by my sort of back of the envelope calculation, are all Democratic-leaning states, with the exception of Utah. All but one of them are in the West, so they are states that traditionally have had weak political party systems and sort of a more populist sort of politics. And, I think the same thing goes for the other states that have, approach having universal vote by mail. That is, they tend to be more democratic. They tend to be in the West, again, with a few examples, Montana being another one. Although your paper shows, and other papers, I think, have shown that there's actually little partisan advantage to voting by mail. That is less than a percentage point. There's a challenge that emerges that we've seen this year in California, that the votes that come in late tend to be Democratic for a variety of reasons. So that's really the question here. How do we identify real instances of coercion, family influence, and so on? How do we separate those from public perceptions? So as far as the paper goes, I'd like to see more details about survey administration. We don't hear a lot in the paper about the survey, when it was taken, certainly people's attitudes towards elections, change quite substantially the further away you move from the election. And how do we use the survey? How do the survey questions assess whether people's fears about voting by mail are real or whether they are a manifestation of support for Donald Trump's claims in both elections that voting was not necessarily on the level? So all of that suggests that the real issue here to grapple with is the difference between beliefs and reality, right? Beliefs that something was awry in the vote by mail ballots and realities. So you identify a few things. I'd encourage you to do these in kind of a systematic way. You talk a little bit in the paper about coercion, about late or slow reporting, and about declining public support. So it'd be interesting to sort of systematize those things. Are those about realities, or are they about beliefs, or to come up with a way to have a theory about these things, as opposed to just saying, these are three things we cover here. So in the case of coercion, this would seem to be a legitimate concern and an important concern. That is, voting by mail, I think in a lot of the United States has become sort of the politically correct thing to advocate for if one is on the left. And I haven't seen a lot of people advocate for this, addressing the very real problem of coercion. There's not really a whole lot of evidence in the data here that it happens, but certainly it is something that we should try to measure, I think, a little bit more carefully than has been done so far. Slow reporting, on the other hand, is a real thing, again, as we saw in California this year, but it's not clearly related to voting by mail. That is, plenty of states that have vote by mail report their results promptly. So I think here it's really a question about whether states should hasten their reporting over the perception that there might be something problematic. Do vote by mail states have a special obligation that other states don't have to report their results promptly? And third, there is the question of declining public support. I wonder here if a comparative study would help. This is a real thing. But again, we've got this political question. Is it the responsibility of the states that have adopted vote by mail to change what they do in response to the idiosyncratic efforts of one politician, Donald Trump, to sow suspicion in voting by mail? It would seem, given the partisan issues I've noted earlier, that it might be in the interest of Republicans to encourage suspicion about voting by mail in the United States, because it can lead to efforts to penalize predominantly Democratic states. So that's really a question for the future, right? Will this sort of thing go away if and when the sort of MAGA movement goes away? And it's a question that we can perhaps learn from looking at other countries. Do other countries with a populist right-wing party in power also sow suspicions about voting by mail? So there's a lot to think about there. The paper, as you note, is fairly early, so you got plenty of time to expand on what you've done. The second, I'll talk about the out-of-country voting paper, the Hina Binte paper. I found this paper fascinating. There are two main sets of questions here as I see them. First of all, should overseas citizens be enfranchised or not? And if so, how? What are the appropriate electoral and representational mechanisms? So that's sort of batch number one. And batch number two, what are the logistical and technological capacities that are required for out-of-country voting? How can we ensure election integrity, enforce rules in different territories, and so on? How do we police for corruption, vote buying, and so on? So you do a really nice job in the paper and in the presentation of really highlighting the problems here. And the graphics, I think, do a nice job of showing this. I wonder a little bit who your audience for this paper is. That is, most of the data are about Pakistan, which is, of course, to be expected since most of your authors are there. This is certainly a problem that exists elsewhere. And so if ultimately you want to present this for an audience outside the country, it probably makes sense to do a little bit more of a comparative study and or give us, the readers, a little bit more detail about Pakistani voters. And I'll get to that in a moment, exactly what I mean by that. But this paper for me raised a lot of issues that would be sort of something to preface before you get to the basic data. First of all, you talk a little bit kind of briefly about divided loyalties. That is, why did people leave in the first place? It seems that there are a lot of differences across countries in why people might leave that would have some effect on how they vote. In some countries, natural disaster or economic problems might have prompted people to leave. In other countries, those who have left may be unhappy with the political regime. And in other countries, particularly countries that are relatively well off, the people who have left the country may be folks who have left temporarily, who are kind of well off, who may be representing the country in diplomatic forums and so on. So I think that tells us a lot about who these voters are, what their leanings might be, and the extent to which they might be valuable to political parties. Yeah, 5 minutes. Okay. So I think that sort of stuff these are all things to focus on. What I'd like to see in the paper, first of all, bolder claims and hypotheses. That is, more efforts to categorize why people leave. To talk a little bit about how stable out-of-country voting is. I think one message that comes through here to me is that political parties will systematically mobilize people or not. So there are questions about the political consequences of this. There are questions about the technology. That is it worth it for countries to maintain a system that does this, especially if they need to safeguard for fraud and so on in ways that they don't domestically? Let me move on real quickly to the Ridout paper. This paper is really, there's a whole story in the United States about election administration folks reaching out to the voters. Travis, as I suspect you're aware, there was an organized movement among election administrators to work with political scientists to communicate with the voters. And I think some of that is reflected in your paper. So the big thing I would say is don't be afraid to talk about the bigger story. My understanding is that the Democracy Fund encouraged a lot of people to do this. And that to some extent, the outreach is, it's coordinated and kind of idiosyncratic, right? There was an effort nationally to do this, and some people picked up on it and they didn't. I think we can see that in your data, or I think you can extract that from the data. So I have mostly data questions here. Why the states you look at and not others? What are the common links in the states that advertised? Who's the audience for the advertisements? Are these folks advertising to low propensity voters, to younger voters? Or are they talking to people who are susceptible to claims about voter fraud? This is the sort of thing that perhaps interviews would pull out. You allude early on in the paper to data on public trust. That might be a nice thing to correlate with the states here. Are the states that are advertising a lot places where people are particularly suspicious about election results? Are these states that were politically competitive in the 2020 or 2024 election? That is, make sense of the states. That's one data question. The other data question I have for you, I think, is a little bit tougher to address. You talk a little bit about the media that are used. Maybe Facebook is just used because it's a place where you can target people effectively, but Facebook is also used disproportionately by older voters, not necessarily by younger voters. So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on whether the choice of media, again, is a choice about how to reach particular constituencies, what those constituencies are, or are these just media that are used? All of this stuff, I think, could be reconciled with the themes and the ads, the figures, and so on. And then at the end, I think ultimately this paper would benefit from a more normative conclusion, as was the case in the other two papers. There's a real question here about how far states should go to address concerns about voting. Most political scientists know that the 2020 and 24 elections were remarkably free of fraud. So does it make sense for election administrators to spend a lot of time talking to people who are skeptical? Will it work, right? Will these people be reassured by these sorts of communications? How much money should we spend in talking to voters? And again, going forward, one can hope that the next US election will not be marked by as much suspicion as the past few. Is this something that we should do in the future, or do we think this was sort of a one-time effort to communicate? So sorry to be rushed. I'm happy to send these comments to folks after we're done here, but I think that covers most of my questions.
Very good. Thank you, Robert. They were very careful and thorough. Didn't seem rushed at all. So thank you. Okay, so we have